Hey everyone. Hey everyone. So, this is the first lecture for the hopefully just two classes that I'll be away from school once my baby arrives. They're both going to be on the topic, broadly speaking, of art and rhetoric, how rhetoric and art interact, what art is, if and how it's different than rhetoric, what beauty is, certainly thoughts from the past, differing thoughts on the nature of beauty, if beauty exists, if beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Topics that were not necessarily planned on the syllabus, but have come up in minor ways throughout my time teaching English 15 and are interests of mine as well as a rhetoric teacher, as a literature teacher, as a fiction writer, as someone who really enjoys art, who listens to a lot of music, who watches a lot of movies, who reads a lot of books, who reads a lot of poetry. This is a compelling topic. And also as a modern person, as we're going to see, where much of our conversation around art has become around the things that we think art communicates. Obviously, in our partisan time, especially what we think the political messages in our art are. So all these things are really interesting to me. And while I'm away, I figured I could make these presentations, these lectures that would enrich your understanding of rhetoric and enrich your understanding of art. So there's this dilemma. And one of the times it recently has bubbled up to the surface, though it's bubbled up, I think, often, frequently within the past decade or so, was when Avengers Endgame came out in theaters. And I remember going to see this movie with some friends. You perhaps did as well, right? It was kind of the end of a very popular franchise, blockbuster franchise of films. People were excited to see how the story was going to resolve, what was going to happen to the characters, things like that. And there's a scene in the movie, a still shot from which is up on the screen right now, where essentially during the climactic fight of the heroes against Thanos, um, there was this moment where suddenly, somehow, without explanation, all of the female superheroes sort of banded together in the span of a few seconds, and like they're like bathed in this golden light. And actually this shot only shows 5 of them, but if you watch the scene, and I'll share this presentation, the slideshow, there's a link to the YouTube clip of this scene. They show up one after another until there's like 12 female superheroes, and everyone kind of, not me, perhaps not everyone, but most people who were watching it had this reaction of, wow, I feel really taken out of the movie. I feel like the movie is just really trying to say something here, whether or not it really makes sense with the plot, with what's happening in the story, with like these characters and where they're at as people. It seemed to break the rules of art for the sake of delivering a message. And even if you agreed with the message, depending on what you thought the message might be, perhaps just female empowerment, right? Women are awesome kind of thing. It was weird, and it felt like it broke the movie in some ways, at least in that scene. It felt out of place. And that relates to this poem by Billy Collins. The poem's called Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So again, this idea here of people sort of looking not for perhaps what Colin is laying out here is sort of the difference between the aesthetic experience, the experience of simply reading a poem and kind of thrilling in how it sounds, how it moves, things like that, and instead wanting to, as he says, tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They want to know what the poem means. They're not interested in this aesthetic experience of a poem, of just reveling in the sounds, reveling in the words, reveling in great lines. And even the irony here is that part of the reason you're able to enjoy this poem at all is because you do interpret it as you read it, right? If you didn't interpret this poem, you wouldn't understand it. Like, you have to do this interpretation thing also. But Collins is saying here that perhaps there's this other side to poetry beyond just a simple torturing a confession out of it, finding out what it means. Again, that's sort of the dilemma. What is the distinction? Is there a distinction at all? And it's not a new dilemma in any way. It is one that has become foregrounded in our highly polarized, highly partisan world, which is something we've, inevitably, I think, had to talk about throughout this semester. Not that I personally want to make any political statements about whether I'm conservative or liberal, whether I'm Republican or Democrat or libertarian or whatever. That's not really my interest. My interest is pointing out the ways rhetoric exists in the world that we actually live in. So taking these concepts, taking these sort of perennial ideas, right, these definitions or these forms, and then seeing how they're alive and well in our world. And this comes up with this idea of rhetoric and art. So all the time, I would say typically, though no, not typically, it really happens on both sides. So for example, Netflix will put out, this just happened recently, it's becoming a thing, I think, online as I'm speaking, some trailers for some of its children's shows where there's LGBT characters, right, and in this sort of bright, colorful children's programming. And more conservative people think you can't have that. You have to take that down. You're messaging to these kids. The art is behaving rhetorically. It's trying to convince kids about this LGBTQ thing. On the other side of the aisle, you have perhaps mockery of, say, really conservative music, really conservative films like God's Not Dead, or like I can't remember the name now, but that movie about it has Jim Caviezel in it, and it's about this I believe CIA agent who busts this pedophilia ring, and people on the left saying, well, that's just like that's conservative propaganda. So the left is like, that's conservative propaganda, or God's Not Dead is conservative propaganda. The right says these LGBT children's shows are liberal propaganda, right? Everything is sort of seen through its rhetoric, and seemingly nothing can escape it. Nothing can escape these accusations. And for their part, artists themselves don't help by often claiming a desire to make political statements in their art, to make political art, to make rhetorical art. Again, often of a political nature, because that our culture is highly politicized. And so if you're going to make a rhetorical statement, it's often a political sort of statement. And that Avengers scene is one example, but it would seem that entire stories, movies, songs, paintings, etc., are built around conveying a message rather than being built around being maybe a good movie, just a good movie or a good song or a good painting. And the list is long, but some famous examples are, as I said, God's Not Dead, the film Nefarious, the Barbie movie. I can't see that other thing I have on the list. I could look for a second, but certainly other things as well. And it doesn't help that in education, that's sort of how we're educated into thinking about art, right? We listen to our teachers and or our parents, and we're kind of educated into looking for the message in things, right? Trying to interpret the meaning, trying to find what the author wants to say, and so on. That's sort of how we're taught to analyze works of art, which means we're taught to view them rhetorically, right? In some sense, literature class, for example, is just a rhetoric class, but it's rhetoric as applied to literary works, works of fiction, works of poetry, things like that. And that's because that's how a lot of the teachers view it as well. As a peer once said, I was talking to him at a conference, and he said, that's what literature is. It's just philosophy that's fun to read, right? So it's just something that's putting forth ideas that it wants you to interpret and agree with, essentially. And not only just friends or peers in education, but this goes way back, right? All of Western philosophy, as they say, is a series of footnotes to Plato, a series of footnotes to Socrates. And Socrates brought this up in the Republic. In the Republic, Socrates is talking about Homer, the poet, right? The Iliad, the Odyssey. And he says, we really shouldn't, in a perfect world, we wouldn't read Homer, and certainly children wouldn't read Homer. And in his explanation, he says, well, Homer's the best poet. He's absolutely the best at the poetic arts. He writes the best poems, writes the best stories. He uses the best language. But the problem, he says, is that Homer's stories contain falsehoods about the gods and about the heroes. So about the gods, he says, the gods are meant to be all good, and yet Homer shows them frequently engaging in evil, lying, cheating, backstabbing, all sorts of kind of depraved things, cheating on their spouses, Zeus throwing Hephaestus off the top of Mount Olympus when Hephaestus is a child, and right, things like this that are really evil, that are these acts of evil. So he says, we really shouldn't read those things because they lie, because they contain falsehoods. And all the way up essentially to at least the modern era, if not the present day, a great writer like Tolstoy agreed. In What is Art, Tolstoy argues that beauty doesn't exist. And if beauty doesn't exist, then art only serves to convey important messages. Right? So if art isn't for beauty, and we're going to come back to this is all by way of introduction and context, but if beauty doesn't exist, then art can't be beautiful, in which case the only purpose it could really possibly serve is to communicate something, is to be rhetorical. And he famously goes on to decry great works of art from the past, including his own greatest works, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. because he felt that they don't convey a direct enough message, and they really don't. They're really more just great stories with great characters and great actions and things like that. And to bring it even more contemporary, many modern artists would agree. As I've said already, many modern artists would agree. I mean, think about going into a museum and how many paintings you see that are just sort of confounding. They're either ugly or they're not beautiful. They're sort of confounding. And seemingly the entire point of the work of art is actually that then you'll go up to the placard on the wall, you'll read that. That tells you kind of what the art means or is trying to say, what the artist wants to convey through their art. And you go, ah, I get it. Right? Saying, ah, I get it is much different than saying, wow, that's so beautiful. Wow, I'm amazed by that thing. Right? It's rhetorical. It's like, oh, I understand sort of the logical argument or the overall argument happening through this work. Instead of kind of this heart reaction of like, wow, I love that. Right? When you hear a great song and you're like, man, I love that song. That was amazing. That's a great song. An example that came to me as I was making this presentation was there's this artist, and I should have looked him up. I forget what his name is. I believe, is still active, and he fully kind of agrees with this. He's at least semi-famous modern artist who one of his art projects was he and this was in museums. He would be in a museum and he would be cooking ramen, and he'd be using like terrible like Americanized ramen with like an American brand wok and like an American brand oven, and everything is like not Asian. It's not actually from the countries these things are from. It's like this Americanized version of it. And the whole point of the work of art, he says, is to kind of make a point about how we lose our culture, how we lose culture when we come to other countries, when we join other cultures, how we're sort of forced perhaps to take these sort of bastardized versions of our own culture. And when he talked about this, he was like, the only annoying thing is no one realized that that it was actually art. Everyone thought I was just a ramen chef. And it's like, well, yeah, like you were just cooking ramen, right? That's very difficult to see as art because it has essentially nothing to do with beauty. It's nothing to do with beauty. Or I think of Banksy. Banksy's paintings, his graffiti sells for millions of dollars. And they're ugly. They're really on the nose political messages that are ugly paintings. But people love, oh, it's so meaningful, and oh, he's anonymous, so it makes the message even more powerful. Again, but they're ugly. Like they're really ugly. They're kind of like teenage poetry, but like in painting form. But again, he's so famous because that people want this rhetorical art, it would seem. And people who ban books seem to agree also. People ban books because they feel the message or the messages within the book or the worldview of the book is not the kind of thing people should read. And so different societies or towns or whatever, or schools will ban certain books. And people love to celebrate when books become sort of unbanned, when they're liberated or whatever. And yet, I think everyone, at least in their own mind, has works of art that they get mad if someone reads or someone watches or someone listens to. because we all kind of have this idea of like, well, no, like you should, like that contains things that are wrong and you shouldn't read that, right? So even if we're against perhaps banning books on a political societal level, I think a lot of people are like, well, but you also shouldn't read, like, yeah, we shouldn't ban that book, but you shouldn't read that book, you know. I mean, tried bringing up like Ayn Rand, the Fountainhead or whatever, in a college classroom. I mean, like the temperature drops a few degrees. I've seen this happen to people where they're like, I really like Ayn Rand, and then people get like angry. They're like, well, that's like she's an evil author, and that's an evil book, and you shouldn't like that book, right? So I think that like we all have this inclination toward thinking, well, maybe you shouldn't read that. Maybe you shouldn't. Maybe there are things that you shouldn't read. Um, Again, because art has this rhetorical quality to it. But should it? But should it? Should we feel that way? Is one of the things I'm interested in exploring here. The dilemma, essentially, I think, then consists of a few parts, namely understanding whether or not art is rhetorical and what we're to do about it if it is. And so I think the most important question is that we actually need a definition of art itself. We need a definition of art that makes sense. And again, in our world, right? I've mentioned this a few times. I do think we kind of have this sub-rational, right, society. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think one of the things actually we've come to value science and math and technology so much that we've stopped thinking broadly and deeply about non-science and math and technology issues. And so a lot of distinctions that were there in the past have collapsed, and we don't understand them anymore. We don't have access to them readily anymore. But a lot of those distinctions are incredibly useful, and we have remnants of them in our world. So for example, there's this helpful distinction I think between art and fine art. And so, for example, I have a degree, an advanced degree. I have a master's of fine arts degree. But if you ask most people with that degree what a fine art is or why it's the fine arts rather than just the arts, right? Because there are masters of arts degrees as well. They'd be like, I don't know. That's just what it's called, right? But actually, this comes from this old distinction between art and fine arts that, again, I still think is incredibly helpful because it's true. I think it's a true distinction. So to get into that, in art describes anything that is made. So a pair of shoes, right? Shoemaking is an art. Table making is an art. Architecture, making a house, is an art. Cooking is an art. Video game design is an art, right? Right? Medicine was thought of as an art because it created health, it made health within the body, it made the body healthy. Teaching was thought of as an art because you would sort of make the student into an educated person. Rhetoric is an art, right? It's an art of discerning the available means of persuasion and crafting persuasive things. Now, it's different than a fine art. A fine art was when something was made with the direct aim or purpose of being beautiful. Okay? So think about it like this. While a table can be beautiful or not beautiful, what really essentially matters about a table is that it functions as a table. You can set things down on it, right? My computer's on a table right now. Well, it's on a desk, right? But the point of a desk is that, it holds things, you can work on it, right? It has these functions that need to be there for it to be a desk. While a spoon can be beautiful or not, what really primarily matters is if it holds your soup. And whether or not a video game is beautiful, it's primarily meant to be a fun game. You can have the most beautiful game in the world, right? Great graphics, good story, things like that. But if it wasn't fun, if it was unfun to play, it would be a bad video game, even if it was a beautiful video game. Because the video game's primary purpose is to be fun to play. It's to be a fun game. And as things have become industrialized, and I think as beauty, the idea of beauty has become more relativized, right? We talk about beauty's in the eye of the beholder, beauty doesn't really exist. Beauty's like, it's just kind of like, it's something we don't take seriously. We've relativized beauty, and we've industrialized how we make things. We've leaned further and further toward this sort of primary function thinking, and less about things being beautiful. Civilization has overtaken culture. As Dietrich von Hildebrand says on this subject, until the beginning of the 19th century and the triumph of the machine, culture had not yet been strangled by civilization. The expression of the spirit, the gift of giving form in such a way that was not practically indispensable, penetrated all the practical spheres of life up to that time. A knife should not only cut well, it should also possess a noble form. A chair should not only be comfortable and solid, it should also be beautiful. In fact, it should sooner be a little less comfortable than be sober and prosaic. Practical life as a whole possessed an organic character, and was therefore united to a special poetry of life. Related to this was the penetration of life by culture, right? So before things were industrialized, people wanted their things to also be beautiful, to serve not just their function, but to sort of give this beautiful ornation to life. But as the practical life of the human being was robbed of its organic character and was mechanized and thereby depersonalized, so too the poetry of practical life was lost, right? You don't walk to work anymore, you drive. You don't, take a walk or read a book or sit down at a table when you eat anymore. You watch your phone, you watch the TV, right? Life has become more mechanized. And even when you get to work, you're not sort of doing things by hand. You're fixing the machine. You're doing things on a computer, right? So life has become more mechanized. I think that's just sort of indisputable. And he says that then the organic character of life is lost, and what happens? The practical requirements in residential homes became a prosaic matter that was radically detached from the affective and intellectual life we lead as persons. So it was detached from the heart, the affective life, and the mind. Railway stations, factories, airports, filling stations, department stores were built to serve technical, neutral purposes. Okay. In all these buildings, it's clear there's no link between the practical requirements and the spiritual requirements of the human being. The latter are neutralized in such a way that they no longer offer any artistic stimulus for the architectural shaping of these buildings, and the building itself becomes an object of technology. And that might sound a little abstract. Let's look at a few examples. So here is exactly what he's talking about with cutlery, right? I mean, we all have that spoon on the left. That's like, those are the spoons that we use in the cafeteria, in our homes, right? When we go over to someone's house, unless they're really breaking out the fine china, we use this sort of bland, it's just a spoon. It serves its purpose. It's not pretty to look at. But it serves its purpose as spoon. It's this mass-produced object. Whereas on the right, we have these more handcrafted, more elegant, more beautiful, more ornate, right? They're fun to look at. And it's cutlery. It's a fork, right? It's a spoon. It's a little serving kind of ladle or spatula there. A little knife. And they're just delightful. They're delightful. They It'd be fun to eat. Like life would be a little better if you were using those instead of the modern spoon on the left, which I'm pretty sure I just got that picture off of Bed Bath and Beyond. Like you can go buy that spoon. It's a few dollars, right? I skipped over accidentally, and now I can't seem to go back. But the previous slide, if you want to look at it for a second in the file that I shared, similar thing. It's a Victorian table versus a more modern table, right? The Victorian table, it's ornate, it's beautiful, it's nice to look at. The modern table is just table. It serves its purpose. You kind of forget it's there because it doesn't draw any attention to itself outside of just being so boring. It's so dull. It just is table. There's hardly any beautiful elements to it at all. And this applies to bigger picture things like architecture, like city design. Times Square in New York City, it's impressive. I would say it's an impressive place. It's like this aesthetic nightmare. You're just like surrounded by these horrible colors, these tall, ugly buildings, huge TV screens that are all showing different ugly commercials, ugly cars, right? None of it's beautiful. It's overwhelming. It's highly stimulating, uh, and it's ugly. Whereas if you're in Rome, you're walking and you just catch this beautiful view, right? Because we'll look at this in a second, but something to think about here is that this is by design. Like this isn't accidental. New York City and modern cities are essentially designed for the sole utility of getting you from point A of commerce to point B of commerce as quickly as possible so that the most amount of revenue is generated. Okay? Whereas ancient and medieval cities were designed for people to live in, for people to walk through every day, for people to enjoy being in. So it's like these views are set up intentionally, they're by design, so that you just enjoy life a little more. Life's a little more beautiful, right? You happen to catch these beautiful sights as you're going through these cities, right? So New York City on the left, you can see it perhaps a little more clearly. It's a designed city. It's all on a grid, right? Because again, the whole point is that you get from point A to point B as quickly as possible, right? It's pure function, right? It's like, well, what's the point of the city? I guess for as many people to live in, right, and spend and generate as much money as possible. And so that's what the city is designed around, is that idea. Rome, it's not really designed, right? There's streets, it's all over the place. Streets get wide and narrow, and it's just bizarre because they actually weren't. It sprung up organically from people living there, wanting to enjoy life there, wanting their kids and grandkids to enjoy life there. And so making it just organically as things were needed and wanted and making it all kind of uniform and beautiful. Again, New York City, it's so impressive. It's like this impressive testament to, I guess, capitalism, to the ability of people to produce things. But I struggle to say it's beautiful. I'm not alone. Frank Lloyd Wright, for example, the famous architect, said if he had the chance, he would just destroy New York City and rebuild it from the ground up because he thought it was so horrible to look at. Again, I'm from New York. There's a love I have of New York City. even still, I think I can't really deny that it's ugly. It's not beautiful. And it's not designed to be. It's designed for its function. And like Von Hildebrand says here, right? There's Phoenix. It's the same. It's grids. It's these ugly buildings. Or you're in an airport and it's just ugly because beauty has not been considered at all. What's been considered is we need to get as many people through this airport as quickly as possible and get them to their terminal and get them on a plane. And so at no point are you taking in the view at an airport. You know, it's sort of oppressive and gray and lifeless and like depressing and alienating, right? These are sort of the consequences of this design that is only for function, is that you feel alienated within them. You feel a little depressed. You feel a little bit like a rat in a cage. There's that great movie, Being John Malkovich, where the main character gets to his office building and it's like he has to crouch down the whole time he's in it. It's like only 4 feet tall, right, to like conserve space and because it costs less to heat it. And it's like it's sort of over the top and ridiculous, but it's this exaggeration of something very real, which is like the feeling of being in an office with cubicles, the feeling of being in an airport, the feeling of being in a modern city. They're ugly. They're not pleasant to be in on a very basic level. Whereas if you go to Rome, if you go to Paris, if you go to wherever, right, Poland, right, great cities in Poland, things like that, they're very beautiful. That you like being there, you like walking around, because they're designed that way. They thought about that when they designed those things, or when those things were being built up. And perhaps more relevant to us is like education buildings. Educational buildings are so ugly. They're so unbelievably ugly, right? So on the left, you have the University of Michigan Law Library, which was built in 1859. And like you see it, and like the picture doesn't do it justice. I mean, you step into that place and you're like, wow, like I want to learn. I want to read. It is good to be in here. You know, this is a beautiful space that I enjoy being in, that I love to be in, and I want to be here, right? It's got the high ceiling, the chandeliers, right? This beautiful stone with the dark wood. It's amazing. It's an amazing space to be in. And now look at same place, University of Michigan, and there's our modern classroom. Like low ceiling, these horrible fluorescent lights. No, I mean, look at the color on the wall. Like, what is that? Like vomit green? That was the best we could do, you know, was vomit green in a classroom when 150 years ago they did that at the same place. They did this law library. And same probably with your high schools. Same with I think Penn State Harrisburg. You know, I like being there. I like teaching there. I try and do a good job. It's ugly. It's not pleasant to be in our classroom. That's why I turn the lights off every time I'm there. I'm like, because at the very least, we don't need these awful, harsh lights on to make the place even uglier and more horrible. Like, it, you want to learn in that law library. You, because it's beautiful. Because it's designed to be beautiful, whereas this modern classroom is designed to be classroom. It's like, well, the function of a classroom is students learn from the teacher. So we all face teacher, teacher faces us. There's nothing else really needed. So you can just throw in this crappy, cheap carpet. You can paint the walls vomit green. You can install cheap fluorescent lights that'll last 300 years. Because it's just about function. It's only about function. And something useful to think about here that I've sort of been talking about this whole time is a difference between primary and secondary goals, primary and secondary ends of things. okay, or primary and secondary purpose. Again, the primary purpose of a spoon is to hold soup, but it may also, in a secondary way, be beautiful, right? The primary purpose of a song is to have a beautiful melody, harmony, rhythm, etc., and then also probably good lyrics with a message, whatever it may be. In our age, where we relativize beauty, we claim beauty isn't real. Well, if beauty's not real, then you don't have to worry about it, right? You don't have to think about it. You don't have to incorporate it into the way you design things. And so then we get all we're left with in, say, architecture is, again, just that primary purpose of function, because beauty isn't real, so we don't have to think about it. So we're just left with function. And then similarly in art, where I think the primary purpose is to be beautiful, and the secondary purpose is maybe to convey a message. Well, if beauty isn't real, if that primary purpose isn't even a real thing, then all you really have to think about is conveying a message, right? So we end up with ugly buildings, and we end up with highly rhetorical, ugly art, right? That doesn't make us feel good. Like being in a modern classroom doesn't feel good. You aren't happy to be there. I know you're not happy to be there. I'm not happy to be there. I'm happy to be there because I like education. I like teaching. I like learning. I like ideas. But the actual space itself is horrible. It's horrible. And it actually works against itself because you just can't wait to leave. You can't wait to get out of a classroom because they're so horribly ugly. You can't wait to get out of an airport. You can't wait to get out of an office building because they're awful. They're awful to be inside. So again, the primary purpose of art then is to be beautiful. I think that's true. I think beauty really exists. We'll talk about that a little bit today, and we'll talk about that next class as well. I'll go through kind of the history of thinking about beauty and why perhaps largely it's been abandoned in the modern world. But for now, no, I think it is real. And again, I think go look at that library and then the modern classroom and tell me what's missing. Tell me what's different if it's not beauty, if it's not this aesthetic thing that the library has and the modern classroom doesn't have, isn't interested in having. So a lot of art does have rhetorical qualities, but again, it is a secondary purpose. Um, and again, when rhetorical supersedes the beautiful in art, we get cringe things like that moment in Avengers, where suddenly the art stops, right? Plot, character arc, things like that. And we just get this cringe message that even if we agree with, it has ruined the art. It's superseded the primary purpose of art, which is to be just beautiful. The primary purpose of a blockbuster movie is just to be a good, entertaining movie. And Avengers puts that on hold for like 10 seconds there to instead push forward a message. Even if it's a message you agree with, that's what it's doing. Whereas when the beautiful in art, in the fine arts, supersedes the rhetorical, it's completely fine. And in fact, many of the greatest examples of art are art that sort of have no rhetorical qualities, which we'll get to in a minute. But like Bach's cello suites. It's like, well, this isn't really saying anything. It just is beautiful. Right? That's just all that it is. And it's great. It's one of the great works of art. And obviously the expression of beauty is different depending on the form. So like a novel needs to have good characters and plot and tragedy or comedy, whatever. A song needs to have melody, harmony, rhythm, perhaps poetic lyrics, and so on, right? For each sort of form of art, for each art form, there's a different sort of focus in order to capture the beauty of that form. And just what exactly is beauty? So we can't just define art and fine art, right? Because fine art within that definition is this idea of beauty, which is itself a hotly contested word. And so I'll talk about this more next class. I'm going to do sort of a deep dive into the history of beauty and of aesthetics. But a starting definition might be beauty is that which pleases when seen or heard. And as the philosopher theologian Aquinas would say, there are three requirements for beauty. First, integrity or perfection, then due proportion or consonance, and also clarity, right? So if you think about like a song, or a story, let's say, integrity or perfection, right? No parts of the story are out of place. No parts of it don't really make sense. No parts of it contradict other parts of it. Due proportion or consonance, so the main character is the main person we focus on, and the side characters we focus on a little less because they're right. So it has like everything kind of is in its proper place. Or like if you were watching the Avengers and there was like a half-hour scene of just like Tony Stark drinking coffee, you'd be like, wow, that's really out of proportion in this action movie. Like it doesn't make sense to spend that much time on Tony drinking coffee. And also clarity. It's clear. It's not vague, right? So like the setting isn't vague, right? Which in Avengers and stuff it is. It's always like a gray city. It's like where are they? Like it's just like it doesn't make any sense. But clarity of who the characters are, what the plot is, what the setting is, things like that, right? No vagueness. Oh, that's simply riffing on Aristotle, who said the chief forms of beauty are order and symmetry and definiteness. And Plato, this isn't a definition, but rather an effect on the person, which is what I've been trying to get at, is the contemplation of beauty causes the soul to grow wings, right? You walk into that U of M library, your soul grows wings. You walk into a modern classroom, you're like, ugh. Like, the soul does not grow wings, in Olmsted, you know. So is art rhetorical? I think yes, again, as a secondary way. I think you can think about it as a spectrum in one sense, from things that are purely rhetorical and ugly to things that are purely not rhetorical and beautiful. The far left, you have something like God's Not Dead. It's really not a good movie. Like as a movie, it doesn't work. But it's very rhetorical. It really puts forward its message, right? I think the Barbie movie is a little better made than God's Not Dead, but still a highly rhetorical film. So like St. Peter's Basilica, sure you could say it's rhetorical. It's trying to communicate ideas about God, about the Catholic faith, but it's also just very beautiful, and so on and so forth, right? Anna Karenina on the very right side, which is blocked off by me. Me purely beautiful. No, but I think Bach and Shakespeare, right? They're very not rhetorical, very beautiful. Okay, and I made more of like a quadrant chart here that we could spend a little time on. But so bottom ugly, top beautiful, left rhetorical, right non-rhetorical. And you have things like Bach, which is I think very not rhetorical, right? I mean, tell me what the cello suites are like trying to say. Good luck, good luck. Whereas it's highly, highly beautiful. Nonetheless, it's a great work of art. Kind of the great Shakespeare plays. Perhaps there's a worldview there that you can read into Shakespeare, but those plays aren't like trying to like send a message. Really, they're trying to tell a perfect story, a perfect tragedy, a perfect comedy. Something like Spirited Away, maybe a little more rhetorical, right? A lot of Studio Ghibli movies are about the importance of nature, disliking industrialization. Actually, a lot of things we've been talking about here. But it's also highly beautiful. And then, whereas like Princess Mononoke on the other side, another Studio Ghibli movie, is a lot more rhetorical. It's really trying to convey messages about being one with nature, about the what nature even is, if nature is moral or amoral or immoral. Lots of more ideas there. You know, George Orwell, highly rhetorical, but also great writer. We'll get into that. Things that the bottom left things that are rhetorical and maybe not like I know I make people mad when I say this, but I think the Barbie movie is like has a lot of really amateurish decision. I think like the characters don't make any sense. The plot is so bad that they basically have to get meta. They're like, oh well, it's Act 3, so we have to go to the and it's like okay, like if you're being that meta, it's usually because the plot doesn't work on its own. The characters are all over the place. I think the set designs are super cool. The costumes are really good. It's funny, right? So like it's not purely ugly. Like, it has some redeeming qualities, but I think a lot of it is amateurish too, and it's highly rhetorical, right? It's putting forward a lot of ideas about women, about men, about feminism, things like that. Um, Bottom left, highly rhetorical and highly ugly. We have a lot of modern art, which we've already talked about. And this was just me I would just add to this really quickly when I thought of something that fit. And it could be debated where exactly these things should go, but I think you get the point, which is that there's sort of a spectrum to these things. And as I've been saying, art that lacks rhetorical qualities are some of the highest examples, the greatest examples of art, of just pure art without rhetoric, pure beauty without rhetoric. So you have like Bach's music, Mozart's symphonies, Van Gogh's paintings. Like, what's Starry Night trying to say? Maybe you could get something out of it, but really it's just lovely. It's just a lovely painting. It's a beautiful painting. Nature itself, right? It's just beautiful, right? That's sort of the original work of art in a lot of ways. And if you can argue that they're rhetorical at all, what they're really typically saying is just they're trying to be about beauty itself, which again just goes back to saying that they're just beautiful. Yeah, and even artists will sometimes transition from one state to another depending on the point in their career. I think Bob Dylan is a really interesting example where he began as a folk singer in the mold of very political folk singers of his time, like Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. But he grew frustrated with that. At one point, he was given a political award by the Democratic Party, and he was asked to give a speech. And in his speech, he said, "To me, there is no left or right. There is only up or down, and I'm on my way up." So he's basically rejecting, at that point, politics in his music. And then his later music explored more abstract and deep lyricism rather than political, rhetorical messaging. Which you can see here, right? This song, "The Times They Are Changing." "Come senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall. For he that gets hurt will be he who has stalled. The battle outside raging will soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are changing." Right? So there's something beautiful about that lyricism. But it's also, obviously, it's literally explicitly addressing politicians and saying it's time for, these new laws, these new political things to be enacted. Whereas later in something Mr. Tambourine Man, he says, "And take me disappearing through the smoke rings of my mind, down the foggy ruins of time, far past the frozen leaves, the haunted, frightened trees, out to the windy beach, far from the twisted reach of crazy sorrow." Right? Or I could do a Bob Dylan, "Yes, to dance beneath the diamond sky." Right? It's not Timothy Chalamet, but it's pretty good. With one hand waving free, silhouetted by the sea, circled by the circus sands, with all memory and fate driven deep beneath the waves. Let me forget about today until tomorrow. So again, a bit much harder to parse what the meaning of that specifically is. I think it's about joy. It's about embracing life. Um, Obviously, far less rhetorical than, come senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Right? He leaves that behind. But there's also a lot of rhetorical art that's incredibly good art. For example, George Orwell. He might be the best contemporary example of someone who's highly rhetorical and rhetorically convincing and a great artist. Right? His novels are just great reads. Like 1984 is a great read. Animal Farm is a great read. And on the flip side, when he writes an essay, his essays are both really rhetorically interesting and just beautiful. They're well written. They're beautiful essays. C.S. Lewis is like this as well. His essays are really beautifully written, and then his novels tend to have a lot of rhetorical meaning that you can get into. Morality tales like the Twilight Zone, right? All those Twilight Zone episodes usually have some sort of moral that they're trying to communicate. Fairy tales, Irish folk songs, lots of sci-fi, etc. All children's literature, or all children's movies, all children's television tends to be highly rhetorical as well, right? People are trying to sort of teach children things through entertaining them. To this day, most children's stuff is highly rhetorical. I think that's one of the things that's so special about like Studio Ghibli, at least in their, I think, like in a spirited way, is it's children's entertainment. It's not really rhetorical, hardly at all, and it's highly beautiful, and that's like very rare in children's entertainment. And to revisit this idea of education, and I said most teachers teach literature as this sort of rhetorical thing. I think that's just because more rhetorical art is easier to teach, right? You can read messages and things. You can learn what they're trying to say. And those things tend to be really good book club picks, for a similar reason. Whereas if you're trying to teach something like War and Peace, you're trying to teach something like Shakespeare, it's really hard because you really can't beat a message out of it, as Billy Collins says. It's just a great work. It's just a beautiful work with a great story, with great characters, with big, awesome plot events, with tragedy, with comedy, right? And so it's hard to teach beauty itself. So a lot of people will take books like that and they'll be like, well, we'll understand Russian history through reading this novel. So it's like, oh, the novel is really just a way to teach history, which I hate. I hate when people do that. Or the novel's just a way for me to force my own ideological reading on something. So, you get LGBTQ readings of Shakespeare. You get Christian readings of Shakespeare. You get postmodern readings of War and Peace. You get feminist readings of Shakespeare, right? You get these things where it's like feminism didn't exist in Shakespeare's time. So you're sort of ideologically forcing a rhetorical reading out of it that just isn't there. It's just not there. But it's because teaching something purely as beautiful is really difficult, especially because most people think beauty doesn't exist. And this leads to the next point about art and rhetoric, which is its connection then to truth. So if art can be rhetorical, which obviously I think it can, and everyone I think thinks it can, this means it can communicate truths or falsehoods. So there's some beautiful art that I think says horrible things, and there's some really bad art that I think says true things. So like I love Cormac McCarthy. I think his worldview and the things he's messaging are evil, like are untrue, evil things. But he's such a great writer. His stories are I love Blood Meridian. It's that whole book is about how the world is only violence and nihilism, which I don't agree with. But I love that book. It's so well written. It's such an amazing work of art. Something rhetorical, that I like agree with, but that's bad art. I don't know. There's lots. I don't want to get. I don't need to necessarily get into my opinions on things like that. But there certainly exists things where I'm like, well, I like what it's saying, but it's a terrible movie, terrible TV show, whatever, terrible book. And this goes back to the idea of banned books, which I'll get to more. But people love this idea of like no banned books, but then it's like again, I think everyone sort of has this thing in their mind where it's like, but also people shouldn't read that book, which is interesting. That's an interesting tension. Right, so we have this great work of art that obviously is trying to say something. If you're like a Catholic or a Christian, you're going to find it says a lot of true things. If you're not, you're probably going to find that it says a lot of false things. Same with here, right? You probably, unless you're a pagan, which people still are, but you probably don't think the birth of Venus really happened. I don't think Botticelli did either. And yet there's a lot here that still is like about like femininity or about womanhood or whatever that perhaps you find true or untrue. Woody Guthrie, "This Land Is Your Land," right? That seems like a patriotic song, but it actually is about communism. It's about this idea that private property should be abolished. People shouldn't be able to own things. There was a big high wall there that tried to stop me. The sign was painted, said private property, but on the back side it didn't say nothing. This land was made for you and me, right? And the last verse too gets more into that. It basically says like if we abolished private property, there wouldn't be like sickness and things, right? So it's like there's this message in this song that you may agree or disagree with. Similar even to this great work, I had this at the top left quadrant of um, my quadrant graph, which is Sonnet 116 by Shakespeare. I think it's highly rhetorical and highly beautiful. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when an alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, though his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. Right? He's literally saying, like, I'm saying true, like, that's what the last two lines mean. He's like, I'm saying true things about love, and I'm making that claim that what I just said is true in this highly beautiful poem, one of the great poems in English language, in the English language. Meanwhile, up at State College, you have, a Penn State classroom. Again, what's this saying? If anything, it's saying all you are here is student who learns. You are simply your function. Teacher is simply their function. They are the one who teaches. You are the one who learns. And it's an aesthetic nightmare. I mean, what's with those red seats and that like lime green, like that looks horrible. It's like it is horrible to look at. That looks like a depressing place to be. And it's a classroom at a great college, like we're all at Penn State. Like I would like to think probably all of us or most of us actually want to be here because we think it's a good school. And yet this is sort of how the people who design the classrooms think of you, is like you are just student, right? You are simply here to learn the things teacher says, and that is all. And that's reflected in the classroom design. Where again, this U of M library, I mean, you're probably relieved even just looking at this compared to looking at that U of M, or I'm sorry, that Penn State classroom. The high ceilings, the chandeliers, the natural seeming light, the dark wood with the gray stone, I mean, it's astoundingly beautiful, and you would be happy to be there. You'd be happy to study there, right? Because again, because it is not only functional, it's functional. It is a library. There are books there and places to study quietly. But it also, I think, treats you more like a human being. I think these things that are beautiful account for your humanity as well. They're like, you're not just a rat in a cage who has to go from point A to point B. You are a human being. You need to feel, as Plato says, you need to feel your soul growing wings, right, in order to want to do things. Your soul grows wings, I think, in this. I've walked through this building. It's beautiful on the outside too. Fun fact: it's the only place in the United States that they considered filming Harry Potter. They considered filming Hogwarts scenes. And to briefly touch on that, I mean, I think Hogwarts really captured everyone's imagination. One of the things that's so interesting about that is the Hogwarts, especially like the classrooms and things like that's just what colleges used to look like. They just looked like Hogwarts. Like this just is a college, right? And it looks like right. Classrooms don't have to be these ugly fluorescent light, vomit green wall affairs. They can be really beautiful. I couldn't get a picture of it, but like if you go to Yale, like that's how at least the older classrooms are. They're beautiful places to be. You want to be there. Simply just be there because they're nice, they're beautiful. They give the soul wings. A last note about banned books to kind of try and wrap that up a little bit before our conclusion. There's this book called The House of God by Samuel Shem, and it's a dark, dark satire, dark humor about working in a hospital. And it is highly rhetorical, highly engaging read, where the message of it is essentially medicine does nothing, doctors do nothing to help people. Um, so much so that you may as well give up. You may as well pretend that you gave your patients medicine when you didn't. You may as well pretend you diagnosed them when you didn't. Because their lives would actually be better if you did nothing than if you did anything. And one of the things I think is interesting about that, this book sort of goes around at University of Michigan. I have a lot of friends, and obviously my wife who went to U of M for med school. And the teachers, the doctors at the school who teach there, some of them advocate for reading it because they believe it's true. Some of them advocate not reading it because they believe it's false. And what's interesting is that while the two sides disagree on whether the book is true or false, both sides are positive. They're certain that it will affect the reader, that it will change the way you see what you do. And that's one of the really powerful things about art and about beauty that I think everyone should be a little more aware of is truth, rhetoric affects the mind, and beauty affects the heart, right? People love the bands that they love. People don't love math equations necessarily, right? But they'll die on the hill of whether a band is a good or a bad band, right? Which is essentially this idea over like beauty and ugliness, I think. And then mixing the two in art is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And while I certainly am not advocating for banning books or art on a political level, I think it's important for people to be aware of that and know like, art isn't just completely unaffecting. It doesn't not affect it affects you deeply, actually. And you should be discerning about the art you consume, right? Um, if you consume a lot of depressing art like Cormac McCarthy, the world might start to look a little darker, right? You might start to see things differently. If you read The House of God, you might you're a pre-med student, you read this book, you might lose your innocence, you might lose your idealism about what medicine is. Art affects people, and it changes the way we see the world. As a final note, we've lost something. is perhaps the grand takeaway. We've lost something. By relativizing beauty, by making beauty something that we don't think exists, we're convinced doesn't exist, we have lost the ability to make things that are beautiful, that elevate the human mind, that elevate the human heart, that give the soul wings. The response to the highly rhetorical art from both sides has only gone to encourage more political art from both sides, more rhetorical art. Our art has become very partisan. It's left-wing art, it's right-wing art, whatever it may be. And then what we all lose out on is just something being beautiful. A movie just being a great movie. A song just being a great song. A band just being a great band. A building just being a beautiful building that you want to be inside. A classroom that isn't harsh and horrible, but rather beautiful and inviting. We all lose out on beauty. We all lose out on the sense that our lives are more than simply the sum of the things that we do, right? When we take beauty away. So hopefully that was at least interesting. If you've never thought about beauty much, or thought of it only as relative or essentially unreal in the eye of the beholder, hopefully this provided at least an interesting other perspective, whether or not you agreed. And the next lecture will be a bit more of a deep dive into beauty, where the idea that beauty is objective came from, where the idea that beauty is subjective came from, and again, what it means for us. I'll see you then.